Good morning. Louise is a hard act to follow, and I thought I would do it by providing a little background to how Louise, Richard, and I, and David Freedberg began to think about this symposium, and then outline some aspirations that we have for its outcome. I like to think that beauty begets beauty, and we first began to discuss the symposium about a year ago in Petra. The image here is not complete. It's somehow, in fact, both of those images are not complete. Can we get the whole image on? Thank you. Here is one of the great temples of Petra, Louise, Richard, and myself. And again, the three of us. When Louise first outlined to us her interest in providing a bridge between neuroscience and art, this is something that Richard and I had talked about with David Freedberg. Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia University, had, on his inauguration, a symposium on art and science in which he indicated that what he saw was one of the great gulfs at the university was to bridge between neuroscience and the various humanities. And that got the three of us thinking about the fact that this might be a fertile area for investigation. And we liked the idea of the symposium because it brought together the aspirations of really two independent groups, the Blouin Foundation that Louise heads and Columbia University. The aspirations of the Blouin Foundation, as you have heard from Louise, is the development of culture and creativity to address the needs of the 21st century. And she outlined very beautifully in her comments exactly how she would like this to be accomplished. The aspirations of Columbia parallel this in a way. Columbia has a mind-brain initiative which attempts to use neurobiology and the exploration of mind as a bridge between the natural sciences and the humanities. Now, there are several areas in which that bridge already exists. In psychology, for example, the concern, the core issue in psychology is to understand how the mind works. And since the mind is a product of brain function, there is an isomorphism, a merger between psychology and neuroscience. This is also true for philosophy. You can't be a philosopher of mind without really talking about the biology of the brain. In sociology, as a result of the work of Tom Insel and Corey Bogman, we're beginning to identify specific genes that are important in group interaction. And that is beginning to give us insights not only into group behavior, but in principle into empathy and aggression. These are the areas in which the bridge is already built, if you will. The initial steps toward bringing these disciplines together has already been taken. We are now in the area of art entering, I think, a more difficult domain. We would like to understand, as I'll indicate, perception, aesthetic response, and creativity, and this is where David Freedberg has provided leadership at Columbia. But in addition, we'd like to see whether neurobiology can make an impact on the law, because it is concerned with the biology of free will, the limits of personal responsibility. We'd like to see whether it make a contribution to ethics, because many ethical issues arise about issues of the brain. For example, to what degree in imaging another person do you have access to their inner thoughts, and to what degree is that private or public? And also, amazingly, business schools and economists have become very much interested in neurobiology because, as you will hear from Danny Kahneman, they're interested in decision-making, and the theories of decision-making that have emerged from social scientists have an enormous impact on neurobiologists. I'm going to focus, obviously, on art in order to outline what I would hope this symposium could accomplish. And to me, this is sort of the core mission. I see the main function of this symposium is to see to what degree is this as an academic workable area. To what degree can one begin to approach the aspects of art, perception, emotional response, aspects of creativity on a neurobiological level in ways that are satisfactory to the artists, to the philosophers of art, and to the historians. Essentially, is there a scientific discipline here that is both rigorous on the one hand and existential on the other? And it's with this in mind that we've really organized the symposium along the following lines. We want to understand, how do we perceive works of art? How do we respond to beauty and spirituality in art? And what are the environmental conditions that lead to an enhanced creativity? And to accomplish that, the symposium is organized along these three topics: visual perception, vision and aesthetics, biology of the aesthetic response, emotion and consciousness, and the biology of creativity. Now, I would argue that I've listed them. This is not the way the symposium actually is organized in detail. We're going to consider aesthetic response first. But in terms of complexity, I would argue this is an increasing order of complexity. We have, as a result of the extraordinary work of Hubel and Wiesel and Semezeki and Marge Livingston, a good beginning understanding of the neurobiological underpinnings of visual perception. We have, as a result of the work of Joe Ledoux and several other people here, Ray Doland, a very good beginning in understanding of the role of brain processes in emotional experience, the role of the amygdala in feeling states. We are far from having a complete understanding of any of these areas. We're at the beginning in each of them of a great mountain range, but we've begun to scale the mountain. But the hard problem, the problem of which we know essentially nothing about neurobiology, which I also hope will emerge in this discussion, is the problem of creativity that Louise referred to. And I'd like to just open up the discussion on creativity, if you will, by considering conceptual methodological problems as well as the issue of insight. The issue of insight revolves around the fact, what's in it for me? The artist sitting in the audience says, what do I get out of this if neurobiologists get insight into art? How does it benefit my own efforts to be creative? And I'd like to touch on that at the end very briefly. But let me begin with the conceptual and methodological issues. First, from a conceptual point of view, this is an issue that people have thought about repeatedly. For example, Nancy Andreasen has recently written a book on it, and it's common to divide the problem into two parts. The kind of personality that is likely, more likely than average, to be creative, and then the moments of creativity themselves. And creative personalities have been described as having several distinctive characteristics. I mean, if you look at Richard Axel, you get a sense of creative personality. Adventuresome, is always looking how to get into difficulty. He has difficulty seeing boundaries of all kinds. He's explorative. I mean, this is a, if you will, a biographical description of Richard Axel. Louise is getting very close to this, but she dresses much better. The issue is, how in people like this does the creative process occur? And clearly, we don't know very much about this, but a number of creative people have described that their most interesting ideas come to them not when they're hard at work focusing in on the problem, but in moments of relaxation, when they're taking a shower, when they're thinking about something else, when they're going for a walk. All of a sudden, issues that were isolated come together and they see a synthesis that had escaped them before. So this suggests in some ways that the creative process has, as an important component, access to unconscious mental processes. And there have recently been studies that people make the simple decisions about whether or not to wear a bow tie or regular tie in a conscious way. But more complex decisions about who will be their partner for life or what kinds of career decisions they're going to make are made by leaps of faith in which incomplete conscious information is available, but it is really unconscious processes that drive this. This is not a novel idea. Ernst Gombrich, the great historian of art, in his collaboration with Ernst Christ, pointed out that one of the distinctive features from a psychological point of view that characterized their perception of creativity was the fact that people who are creative have easy access between unconscious and conscious processes. They call this a regression in the service of the ego. Now, commonly, when regressions occur, they're not under the control of the individual, as in a psychotic episode. But if you will, creativity has with it components of that kind of a regression, but it is under the control of voluntary mental processes. And I want to elaborate on that, the idea of regression in the service of the ego, by developing the Louise McBain hypothesis of creativity, which is supported by Chuck Closersfielding and Richard Meier, and maybe they can elaborate on this later on. Louise feels very strongly that her creativity derives from her dyslexia. And Chuck Close, whom I met through her recently, describes this very beautifully. He said, I have enormous difficulty reading. I can't add 5 and 5. I have to use dominoes in order to do that. I can't handle three-dimensional forms. I can't look at a face and really deal with it. I have to flatten it in order to deal with it. And his whole artistic endeavor came as a response to his inability to deal with the complexities of the visual world as other people see it. This is a very interesting idea. I think it does not explain all of creativity, but it may very well be that a certain component of creativity, obviously this is a dimension of personality that has many roads to it, but a component of it may be an attempt to overcome certain deficits in the handling of the outside world. And how is one to think about it? I'm throwing this as out as an idea. Don't take this seriously. There's absolutely no evidence to support this. But we know that in several areas, for example, if a person is born blind, their other sensibilities often are enhanced. Their tactile sensibilities are enhanced. The ability to read Braille is much greater than people who are not blind. Not simply because of motivation, but because there's a greater representation in the brain of tactile sensibility. It is possible that the alteration in wiring in the brain that occurs with dyslexia allows an enrichment of wiring in other areas of the brain. For example, the Wernicke's area, which is involved in perception of language, which may be altered in the wiring of people like Louise, that area may now be free to be recruited for other kinds of activities, including creative activities. And perhaps that carries with it the ability to have regression in the service of the ego. Perhaps people with this kind of wiring have easier access to the unconscious than other people. I throw this out as a metaphor, only to indicate this. What I would like to do is to move ultimately, and I'm not equipped to do this, to move ultimately from a metaphorical level to actual imaging studies. So let's image a population of creative people with dyslexia, compare them to creative people who do not have dyslexia, and to see to what degree different problems, different brain regions get involved. I would also like to say a word that I've talked to before with Jean McConaughey Bollinger and also with Sarah Mack, who are in the audience, about methodological considerations. People like Richard and I, and Joe Ledoux, and many people here, are really empirical scientists. And our creativity is probably in a much more modest level, but the question arises, to what degree is creativity in science similar to creativity in art? Last night at dinner, the issue came up that it's a very different kind of creativity, and certainly will have different components of it. But I would argue there are some core similarities in creativity in all areas. And I just want to give you one very obvious example of that, and that is, to a surprising degree, particularly in modern art, you find that artists use the same strategies that Semizaki and I and others in the audience routinely use, and that is they themselves are reductionists. Let me simply show you with a series of images from Rothko. In the 30s, when Rothko was a figurative artist, he was already beginning to use block-like forms in his art, as you see in the background here. But with time, his interest in the warmth of human interaction, in the spirituality of art, began to be transformed into abstract art. He, if you will, reduced the complexity of the image, now making the block-like images touch each other, but losing some of the figurative detail, but none of the spirituality, none of the warmth is lost. If you go to the classic Rothkos, which of course this image does no justice with because it doesn't indicate the depth of the color that emerges in these images, but I once stood in front of one of these Rothkos at a Rothko retrospective, and I said to myself, you think you're a reductionist? Look what this guy is doing. And he will go into complete blacks. If you've ever been to the Rothko chapel in Houston, stood in front of that and had this wonderful spiritual response, even though there is no form and essentially no color. You realize that great artists also use reductionist strategies. So my final point is this. Okay, so this is fascinating for us. You know, this is the kind of set of problems we would love to tackle. And we hope that neurobiology over the next 50 years will get to the point where it can address these problems in an intellectually satisfying fashion. But what's in it for you? What is of value to the artist in this? And I would give by analogy what the understanding of human anatomy did for Leonardo. You know, understanding what the actual structure of the human body is like, you know, what the muscles are like, where the tendons insert, freed the artist up. He now saw what reality was about, and he could use it effectively in his work. I would argue that as artists learn about how the brain functions, how it perceives, how it feels, how it responds to creative acts, that insight will be extremely interesting and useful to artists because they will be able to use it in a novel way. Jean Macagna-Bollinger actually has attempted to do that. She has attempted to communicate directly from her brain to her paper. This is an intuitive guesses, if you will, how her brain functions. What we'd like to do is to move this to the next level, to actually use insights that come from empirical studies of the brain in order to give artists the knowledge of what we understand about the brain to see whether they can use this as a source of new inspiration.